You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Shirley Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Maura Roosevelt.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories, bringing you the very best author interviews from the best writers writing today. I'd like to thank some sponsors today that make the show possible. Patricia Gillum, A Superhero's Duty, a fight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the deaths of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city aren't out of danger. A Superhero's Duty by Patricia Gillum. There's a link to it in the show notes. I'd also like to tell you about my friend Crystal Pico Watanabe of Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. Visit Crystal and her team of 8 people who help her provide services to fiction authors. Crystal's full slate of services now include beta reading, manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors, you can also inquire about putting your books in her Book Lovers Box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. This is free for authors for a limited time. PicosHouse.com for all your book publishing needs. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have my guest, Maura Roosevelt, on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book called Baby of the Family, and she has an incredible story to share. Welcome to the show today, Maura.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Maura, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, my goodness. That's a great question. I think that I do have a memory. I've wanted to be a writer for basically my whole life, but I do have a memory of it being actually a snow day when I must have been very young, maybe I was 10 or so, and I had been reading stories all morning long, and I remember having lunch and thinking, you know what would be great? If I could somehow manage to make a career out of writing stories, that would be a good thing to do.
How old were you, do you think?
I think I was pretty young. I think I was probably 10 or so. I just have always loved reading, and actually, strangely enough, my dad keeps a file on me and my sisters of all of our school reports and that kind of thing in them. And I actually recently looked through it, and there was a little report from my kindergarten teacher that said, "Story time is very special to Maura." And I thought, you know what, it still is.
I'm one of those weirdo dads as well that likes to collect
really?
Everything. Yeah, it's an obsession.
That's great.
Yeah, but I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
So your dad collected these things and saw that the teacher had said that about you. Did you remember any time where your parents or a teacher saw that gift in you and encouraged that?
Yeah, I went to this very cool school until I was 14, which is this small progressive independent school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they really they asked their students to write all the time. So we had something called day books that were basically journals, but we didn't have to write about our lives in them. We just could write about anything we wanted. We just had to write for several, for a period every day. And I do remember maybe in the and sometime in middle school, my teacher is saying, you really love writing in your day book. Is writing something that you want to continue to explore, and encouraging me to do that.
I love that. There's every writer goes through those dark periods, the dark night of the soul, where
Yes.
you have this dream, but it just seems like it's never going to happen, and everybody struggles with those doubts and all that. And but so often there's that one little piece of encouragement that people can look back on, and a lot of times a teacher or parent maybe will give that encouragement just as a throwaway. They don't really think that much about it, but it's those things that we hold on to. And I love to hear the stories from people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
In this day of standardized testing and, with our education system being, very homogenized, it seems like, I love the idea that schools are still encouraging kids to write and to give them a place every day to do that. I think we need more of that.
I do too. Absolutely. I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah. So, did you pursue writing, in college? Was that something that you had a focus on from the beginning?
I did. Yeah. I've actually kind of just always loved writing and kind of always, stuck with it. So I did some creative writing in college, although I was an English major. So creative writing was just, something that I did on, as part of the English major. And then, I ended up going to grad school for fiction writing also, so I got an MFA.
Nice. What sorts of things did you envision yourself writing? Did you have an idea of the kind of writer you wanted to be?
I didn't, which was potentially part of my early struggles coming out of grad school. This was a book that I actually never imagined that I would write. I spent most of my time in grad school writing a different novel that I then that is still in a drawer. And it's also a family story. So I think I'm just drawn to family stories, although I wasn't necessarily aware of that. But that is a family story that I was working with for a long time. And I finally said, you know what, this isn't going in the right direction. I'm going to start a new family story.
Well, you yourself have a pretty unique family story. You have an interesting last name, one that we are all familiar with. Who were your great-grandparents?
So, FDR and Eleanor are my great-grandparents. So I am on the FDR side of the Roosevelt family. Nice.
What was it like growing up with a famous lineage like that?
It's my parents are incredibly down to earth. So growing up, they made sure that my sisters and I had like a very normal childhood and felt like very normal kids. But at the same time, we did, as we got older, we did learn about the great works and accomplishments that FDR and Eleanor did in the world. And so we sort of developed a sense of admiration for them.
Sure.
And feeling, lucky to be related to such impressive people. But at the same time, feeling like, normal kids that just happen to have a last name that people asked us about, basically.
When people find out that you're related to those Roosevelts, do people treat you differently?
I don't think they treat me very differently, but this is something that I was playing with in the book. So,
right.
I think, so the book is centered on this fictional family called the Whitbys, who were this old aristocratic New York family, and who have fallen from grace. And the young generation of Whitbys, they feel this great sort of burden from how they think that other people have expectations of them, and they may have some expectations of themselves. But I think that's a real difference between my family and myself and the main characters in the book, is that I think and it may be because the characters in the book, they had largely absent parents and not very supportive families. So they didn't really have anyone to explain to them or teach them that these, they didn't have to live up to these unrealistic expectations.
Right. You mentioned that the stories you were working on before your new book, Baby of the Family, that they all explored these family dynamics.
Yeah.
What is it? Do you and some of the best stories throughout history are stories about family and how we connect with one another and the things that are passed down, good and bad, in our past, things we had no control of but we inherit and things like that, and you explore a lot of those themes in this book. What is it, do you think, that is this common thread that we all love so much in uncovering family stories?
That's a great question. I think that, talking about expectations before, I think that all families, all families have their own legacies and certain expectations, whether they're teeny tiny families of 2 people or these great families of 25 people. I think, whether it's a particular set of traditions they're expected to follow or, a career path or a job that they're expected to have, most people, I think, are born into a family that is complicated by things like that. And so I think that really, specifically, family stories are something that a lot of people can relate to. And so in this book, the sort of infighting and jealousy and greed might be particular to this kind of wealthy grand family, but the interpersonal relationships and the complications between siblings is something, and siblings and parents, I think, is something most people can relate to.
Yeah. Am I right that Baby of the Family was originally a short story?
It was, yes. So the short story was focused on only one of the novel itself is about these 3 half siblings who are in their 20s and 30s, and so the short story itself was about only one of those siblings named Shelley. She's really the most lost character in the book, and she in the short story, she's in her early 20s and she's dropped out of this fictional college in Poughkeepsie, New York, and she returns to New York City, where she's from, and is totally broke, and then goes on Craigslist and gets this sort of seedy job on Craigslist. So that was what the story was focused on. But then as I just kept writing it, and it became a longer and longer story because I started to imagine, I started to ask myself, what was Shelley's family like? Does she have siblings? What's her relationship with her mother? What's her relationship with her father? And then the greater Whitby family kind of developed out of that imagining. Are you a big short story writer? Is that a form that you like to write? I absolutely love writing short stories, but I do find myself writing really long short stories. So I think I'm more and I've had some friends who are readers and teachers tell me, even with other stories, like, this is a 45-page short story. It might be a novel. So I think I might be more inclined to novels.
Yeah. There's something kind of magical about short stories that allow you to kind of drop the reader right into a situation. And it really is a very different creature than the novel. How difficult was it taking that single point of view story, from the one sister, and then expanding this out? How did you begin to, kind of deconstruct that story to make the bigger story?
I wrote a lot of her Shelley's sections of the book first and all at once, and then I started to write about the stories told from other perspectives. So the stories told from her half brother Nick and her and then finally her half sister Brooke. But I actually, because I sort of began to think of them first as short stories and then let the complicatedness of their storylines kind of expand beyond what would be appropriate for a short story.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking of it, that everyone has their own story to tell and then figure out the things that bind them together later.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. How much of you and your family goes into this novel? You know, as writers, we always put little pieces of ourselves in things, even though we don't like to admit it. But you know, there's and sometimes we show up as characters that no one would suspect. How much of you
Absolutely.
and your life goes into this?
Well, you know, I think I would really hope that I don't identify with any of the three main characters in the book, because in many ways they're not really admirable, and they're sort of struggling, lost, and spoiled. So I'm hoping that I don't identify with any one of them in particular, but I do have affection for each of them, which I think helped me to write their stories and craft them into believable characters. And in terms of the greater story, this is not, the Whitbys are definitely not my family at all, especially not my nuclear family. But I did borrow some sort of bigger picture details from my greater family story. So, for example, the patriarch in the book is married 4 times, and my grandfather was also married 4 times.
Those are fun things to play with that let you explore maybe the other side of, you know, we all inherit our family story, and we don't really have any control over it, and we inherit a very particular side of the story. It's fun to look at that from different angles that someone outside the family might get to see.
Exactly. Yes. So much fun. And I think that in my actual family, my father and his half siblings are very much at peace with each other, and at peace with how their father interacted with all of them. But it was fun for me to look at it from a different angle and say, what if that wasn't true?
Right. You mentioned earlier when we were talking that the Whitby family is a family fallen from grace, if you will. That these are people that once their name meant something to people, and now, you know, if someone died, no one would know. What was it like looking at this family that once was something and now have become something that no one really cares about? What did that allow you to explore as a writer?
You know, I think the main thing that allowed me to explore was how our childhood and upbringings affect us as adults and our adult actions. Because I think the characters in the book, they're given all of these. They feel that they have all these expectations placed on them, and as members of the Whitby family, they're expected to do big things in the world and make a name for themselves. And this is really for these characters, for Shelley and Brooke and Nick, it's really a burden for them. So they're growing up sort of fighting against these expectations that they really haven't been given the tools to. They haven't been given the tools to do great things in the world. So there's sort of these unfair expectations. But I think that the whole premise sort of allowed me to explore that and how family expectations influence us as adults.
Right. One of the things I love to talk to people about is how a sense of place affects the way we write, the stories we write, and how places almost become characters. And a lot of times when we talk about that, we're talking about maybe a particular region of the country and how those things we inherit, influence us. You have a really interesting way in this book that the architecture, the specific places, almost become a character in the book. Would you talk a little bit about that and what architecture and the specific places where people meet and live and the things that are kind of inherited in our families from those spaces?
Yeah. So I think that the sense of I was trying to use place and home in a couple different ways in this novel. So I think that Baby of the Family is really a New York novel, and it uses various neighborhoods and buildings in New York in a really substantial way, and I think it sort of over-aggrandizes them and sort of makes the city this dreamy place. But I was doing that on purpose because I think in the minds of many of the characters, they think of New York as this grand, glitzy, exciting place. So I kind of wanted to show the city through their eyes. And then at the same time, an issue in the book is that the homes of where two of the half-siblings live, where the home in New York where Shelley lives and the home in Boston where Brooke lives, are potentially going to be taken away from them because they were all left to the other youngest child, Nick, in their father's will. And so Shelley and Brooke are fighting, just fighting to maintain ownership over these houses and these spaces in a way that I think is sort of unreasonable, because I think these spaces for them are really about their childhood, that they feel so and they feel so conflicted about their childhood that they think if they hold on to these spaces, maybe they can sort of sort something out about their upbringing.
Well, speaking of Nick and the battle with the sisters, if you will, you add another wrinkle to the story, and to Nick's story, in that Nick is adopted, which makes him just as much heir as the others, but brings on certain tensions because the sisters feel more entitled than him, and that's an interesting dynamic that you introduced to the story. What made you come to use that tool?
So I actually think that this is another aspect that was actually borrowed from reality. That in many of my my grandfather's and his siblings' marriages, they adopted several children. So I do have many members of my family who are related to me, but not by blood because they're adopted. So I do think that there is always, especially when a family legacy is so complicated, like the Whitby legacy, right. I think there can be some consternation over blood relatives, and it's almost like this divine right of blood lineage becomes a question, and in my opinion, adopted children are completely part of the family, but I do think that is an issue that could come up.
Well, yeah, and it makes for a dynamic story, because, blood is a strange thing. It's kind of like our family stories that we inherit and we've talked, about, in that, you can do genealogy and you could look and you could find a relative who, served in the Revolutionary War and was a war hero and you've got this great story to tell, but what ultimately does that mean for you and your story. It's wonderful, but can we really claim any heroism for ourselves? It's these things we inherit, but they, what do they mean? And that's a wonderful thing to explore in a story like this. With every great fall from grace story, another thing that we love to read are redemption stories. Do we find any redemption in any of these characters? Without giving away too much.
Yeah, without giving away the action of the story, I do think that there is some redemption, and sort of ironically, Nick is the one that, although he's the one that feels the least connected to the family or wrestles with that connection the most. In the end, he is really the one that pulls the half siblings together and allows them to have sort of a sense of normalcy and a sense of acceptance that they are a family, if even if they are an atypical family.
Right. Maura, when people are finished with this book, what do you think what do you want them to be left with, other than having an entertaining story that maybe we can see a little bit of ourselves in? What do you hope people take away from the story?
I hope that people really, I hope that they don't take like one pat statement about how families work or how social class in America works, but rather they sort of, I would love for readers to take away a series of questions about, what constitutes a loving family, and how does social class make people, or the social class of one's family, make people view themselves, and how does it influence their actions in the world? I also just would love for people to sort of, while they're reflecting on these things and reflecting on their own families, just sort of laugh about how hard it is for, everyone to become a grown-up, basically.
Maura, I know this is your debut novel. How does it feel? Novels get worked on for so long before they ever see the light of day. How does it feel to have the book out and to have your story in front of people?
It feels very good, but also a little nerve-wracking. And, I was working on it for so long that it kind of, the idea that that a larger audience was actually going to read it, kind of got lost in the fray. And so now that it's out in bookstores, that reality is hitting me.
Well, it's a fantastic novel. I love it. Maura, I wish you the utmost success with the book. If people are just learning about you and your story, is there a place where they can connect with you online, learn more about you and all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm active on Instagram, but I also have more information about the book on my website, and I'm also going on a little book tour. So all those dates are listed on my website too. And that's just my name is just MauraRoosevelt.com.
Excellent. And I'll put those in the show notes where everyone can easily find it. Maura, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to talk to you.
You too. Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
He led Jason to a small bistro. The door set tiny bells to chime as they entered. The place shivered with smells. Coffee, hot chocolate, and croissants. "This," he said, extending his arm towards a woman in an apron, "is Jennifer. She makes the best scones and is tragically spoken for." He kissed the woman's hand. She was plump, in her 50s. She had left one curler to dangle at the back of her head this morning. "If it's a tragedy to you, this is the first I've heard of it." She swatted at him with a menu. "Why didn't you speak up 20 years ago, lady killer?" Jason sat. Jennifer put a glass of water in front of him. "And who is this fine gentleman?" "This," said Hedwig, joining, "is my son's great-grandfather's great-great-nephew." "That's a lot of greats." Any great whatever of Hedwig is great by me. She giggled at her own wit. I'll be back for your orders. Hedwig swatted her rear end with a menu as she left. He made small talk about the bistro, the specials, what was good, the Benedict, or not so, the hanger steak. When their orders came, coffee for both, eggs for Jason, a scone for himself, he got down to business. I met your grandmother about, a year ago. Valerie and I have a mutual interest in old families, particularly old families related to the legend for obvious reasons. Valerie's lived in Tarrytown for years, though her family's up near Boston. Now don't worry, I don't believe all that nonsense about a headless horseman. Valerie's the superstitious one, but the Van Brunts are definitely the family in Irving's story. Hermanus Van Brunt and his wife Agatha were farmers in the village back in 1780 or so. This was during the Revolution. Hermanus grabbed title to lands left by a Tory family who'd been tarred and feathered and shipped back to Britain. Do you know your history? Sure, Tory, loyal to the king. Benjamin Franklin broke with his own son who was a Tory. Smart boy. Traitors to the cause, and that was serious business. The British marched straight through here during the war, chased George Washington off Manhattan and out to New Jersey. And after they were kicked out again, a lot of Tories were kicked out with them. Anyway, the Van Brunts took over some farmland north of Tarrytown. They had a son, Abraham, and, of course, their son Abraham married a wealthy heiress, Katrina Van Tassel. Yes, all that is true. It's public record, just like the legend says. My mother left behind quite a few documents written by Abraham Van Brunt, Brom, in Dutch mostly. He was powerful around here. With Katrina's money, he became the biggest stone merchant in the state. He died in 1850. After him, it's Dylan Van Brunt, his son Joseph, the grandson, then Cornelius, then... Sorry, genealogy is not my thing. No? Why was Eliza doing research on the Van Brunts? She wasn't. She was looking into the Cranes. That's what made us such fast friends. I don't get it. We do go back a ways, your family and mine. More coffee? Jennifer appeared at Jason's elbow. Hedwig nodded, and she poured. Still not getting it, said Jason. But he did. Hedwig turned to the waitress, and Jason knew what he would say. My lady, may I present? He raised his coffee cup, proclaiming, the last descendant of Ichabod Crane.